Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. Hunter Dane, introduce himself to our listeners and viewers at home.
Hello, all you great nerds and great listeners. My name is Hunter Dane, and I'm a newly published author in a very specific field of lit RPG, kind of a spicy area, so may not be for everybody, definitely not PG rated, but worked under different names in the fantasy field and even in nonfiction. So kind of a bit of a portfolio there, but for under this name, make sure to check me out. I've just released the first book in a series called Master of Swords. And you can check it out on Amazon. A very distinctive cover with two very pretty ladies on it.
Outstanding. All right. In the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we found them. So we interview several small presses. And so when we interviewed Royal Guard Publishing, we asked, hey, do you have any of your authors? Because they do Harem Lit, which like we've talked to Eddie Sky about. They also do Game Lit, which is Jay Parsons. We've already shared those interviews. They're kind of all over the place as far as genres, but they make some quality audiobooks. So when I asked for volunteers, so to speak, Hunter, he jumped on the grenade, and here we are. But before we go any further, Hunter, we do have to do the religion questions. Are you ready for this?
All right.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Well, I have to say, I aim to misbehave. So it's Firefly for me, baby. Probably the best show that should have gotten more than one season, and unfortunately probably proof that quality science fiction is a tough go in television, just for that example alone.
Yeah, the problem with that is it was on the Fox Entertainment where good television goes to die. And so it was poorly mismanaged. And of course, you remember it originally aired in the era of DVR, and they didn't know how to count that with the Nielsen rating. So anybody that DVR'd it didn't get credit. And then anytime, because it was on Friday, they bumped it because of football or a political speech or what have you. Anybody that had recorded it, it didn't record, you're recording X show. It was, you're recording X show at X time slot. So anytime it was late, well, you recorded something else. And so, again, it messed with the Nielsen ratings. So it's kind of doomed for mismanagement.
Yeah, it's a shame. I guess in a sense, it's one of those classic examples of don't cry that it's over, just be happy that it happened in the first place, because we did get a movie. What, like, wasn't it like 10 years or so after the series ended? We finally did get a movie. I thought it was pretty good.
I enjoyed Serenity. The Wash death is an example of how to waste an important moment, because just having him die, like, obviously war is hell, and sometimes people die for no other reason than that they were in the wrong place at the right time. But in fiction, you can make it mean something. If he had died, be like, hey, telling his character that was his wife, it's going to be a rough landing, but I'm going to get you there safe. And he had died like saving everybody. Heroic end, people would still be talking about it. And then instead, it was just like, nah. So it was a little bit of bad writing, although overall great concept, and a little bit of poor management on the back end.
I would agree with you on that one. I will say, though, is interesting. You know, the old trope that if you have somebody who is, say, 3 days from retirement, shows a picture of their kid, whatever, they're going to be the ones to die, right? I have to admit, I kind of saw that coming and it's a beautiful line in the film where, do you remember his wife actually says that she wants to have a child with him and she wants to meet that person? I'm thinking, oh my God, one of them is so dead, probably him at that point. It was a beautiful moment designed to get you that empathy. It was beautifully done, but I'm like, oh, man. And I remember, as a writer, we see the bones. We see the leads. We see the little lines cast. And that's one of them right there.
Yeah, it's just like in Mill Sci-Fi where you've got a lot of POVs. The minute somebody comes out of the blue and you learn a little bit about their backstory, you can almost guarantee they're about to die.
Exactly. Particularly if there's some pathos to the backstory, right? You know, oh, I was just trying to make good to get to feed my family. Or, oh, this is the woman I finally married after 20 years. Or, I can't wait to get back home to see my kids. Yeah, red shirt. Hang a red shirt on him already.
Although if you're doing fantasy or military fantasy or sci-fi military fantasy, you could always send them to hell and bring them back. So I mean, there are options there.
There's that, yes.
But nobody sees it coming. All right. So because we are polytheistic here at the Blasters of Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, Wheel of Times, or Chronicles of Narnia?
I'm going to piss off some Wheel of Time fans here, but I'm going to have to say Narnia. I'm a classicist when it comes down to it. I want to visit a world that I actually would want to live in, as opposed to worrying about getting a knife at my throat. Not to mention, it's not a vehicle for nihilism. So therefore, Narnia it is for me.
Excellent reason. I do love the classics. And it held up okay. Like I've read it with my kids since I read it as a kid. And I just, I don't know, you can recapture that sense of wonder, but I mean, it does a pretty good job of second read.
I think it does. I mean, and even they did 3 of them, I think. Disney attempted 3 of them, and give them credit. It may not have been perfect, but at least they didn't take a steaming crap on it the way they do with a lot of vehicles they get. So I think they treated the source material reasonably well. And if you're a Narnia fan, or if you like it, I have to say one of the more interesting untalked about things about that is that, in my opinion, this is opinion only, that Edmund, to a degree, was the hero of the first book. He was the kid, remember, who betrayed his family, remember, for some candy, for Turkish delight. But here's why I say he truly had a heroic moment in that book, is because he volunteered to go fight the White Witch with everyone else, all right? But of the people who did that, he was the only one that knew the consequences. Remember, he had suffered under her. Okay, he knew if they lost, they'd be dead, tortured, frozen to death, whatever. Everyone else went out of sense of duty, companionship, because they were friends with Mr. Thomas. But he knew exactly the price that could be paid. So I give him top status in that book.
Definitely a redemption arc.
Mm-hmm.
I said definitely a redemption arc.
I would agree, 100%.
All right. So one of the crying shames of adulthood is they stop asking this question. So we're bringing it back. But what's your favorite dinosaur?
Oh, now, that is an easy one for me. And that would be the Acrocanthosaurus. That is my hands down favorite dinosaur of all time. The reason being, the Acrocanthosaurus is basically a smaller version of the T-Rex. It's in the same general family, okay? Family of theropods, about 15 feet tall, 30 feet long, pretty big. And the reason it's my favorite is because one stomped its way across the Cretaceous period only about 2 minutes from where I used to live in central Texas. And the footprints are still in the stream bed. You can go down there. I went down there to take a look at it. You talk about having a chill seeing these footprints easily the size of both your hands put together. This thing chasing something else. What would that have been, about 65, 70 million years ago? It sends chills down my spine. And yeah, that's my number one guy right there.
Okay. That's a good reason. The fact that those survive, I mean, the odds of the right circumstance for that all to happen, it's mind-blowing when you think about it.
Oh, I agree. In fact, to add to the mind-blowingness of it, to me, talk about the perfect kind of setup for a memorable visit to the Cretaceous, okay? This thing stomped across a creek bed, all right? This creek bed, you can get to it, but you have to park off the freeway and you have to hike about a quarter mile down through the brush and the stone, and you have to get it at just the right time where the stream is low, usually in the autumn or the winter here, or it should be summer or early autumn here in Texas, where the water's low enough that you can go see it. Otherwise, it's about waist steep there most of the year. So it's a very privileged thing to be able to see this, and only for part of the year you have to time it just right. It's kind of like, I don't know, finding a Stonehenge rising out of the ocean once every year or whatever. You have to be at the right beach at the right time of the right year to catch that. And that adds to the romance of it, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know. There's just something about dinosaurs, especially for young boys. I think I haven't met a boy who didn't like dinosaurs as a kid.
I agree. And you know what? Here's interesting. Let me tell you something interesting. When I was in college, I actually got a chance to ask a paleontologist one of my burning questions I had since I was a kid. And which was this, is that every kid, at least boys do, probably girls too, I would hope, love dinosaurs, right? Why is it that everything cool lived at that time? To which he said, well, it's partially familiarity. Obviously, the biggest thing ever lived animal-wise is alive now. It's the blue whale. And I said, yeah, but you don't have like 40-foot 40-foot carnivores stomping around, things like that, or even bigger things in the Jurassic. Why don't we have any cool stuff? He actually did have an answer for me, but do you want me to tell you what it is real quick? I don't want to go too far off topic. It's kind of cool. His answer, which may be debunked by now, I don't know, was that it had to do with the way the continents are. Back during the Jurassic and Cretaceous times, there was an equatorial ocean. Remember, you had Gondwana in the south, you had Laurasia in the north. The equatorial ocean kept the Earth a good deal warmer than it is today. Think of it like pretty much every place being like Florida. You're going to get a lot more growth in vegetation, which of course would grow more animals and would support the growth of these incredibly large carnivores. Today, we have a circumpolar current that goes around Antarctica. In general, the Earth is quite a bit cooler than it was then. You will not have the biomass necessary to support a larger animal. There's your answer. I thought it was reasonable.
And well, the only change that I know of to that is recently they found a skeleton in Central America of a cold-blooded bug of some sort that was about as, I remember they described it as about as big around as a Volkswagen bug and long. And in order for it to exist, because they know it was cold-blooded, they had to reevaluate the temperature of the air by at least 5 degrees.
I can see that.
It was even hotter than we think in order for this creature to exist. And we know it exists because we found one. But the thing that's always fascinating me is in the last couple of years, we've seen like especially the East Coast in the Northeast, fish that were like, oh, that thing hasn't existed for 100 years or whatever. And they're just washing up on shore, like recently deceased. So clearly they're still out there.
Yeah, well, the way I see it is there's hope. There's hope for Megalodon. I'm hoping for Megalodon. Right. Everybody wants that.
But yeah, so it's interesting. Did you ever get into the what's the word? Was it the dinosaur show where they went through the time loops?
I don't know about time loop, but yeah, I think the one I'm thinking of you're thinking of is the one where the guy basically goes back in time and interacts with the dinosaurs, kind of like the English version of that Australian guy that went and messed with marsupials and things. That one, I think. It's Walking with Dinosaurs, I think it was called.
Dinosaurs and Time Anomalies.
Okay, maybe I don't know that one, but I bet you it's in the same vein, you know?
Oh, I'm drawing a blank. There was one in the UK and one in the Primeval. There we go. Woof. TBI memory for the win. So it was called Primeval. One was set in the UK and one was set in Canada. And basically all of the cryptids that people are like, oh, you're crazy if you believe that, were actually just dinosaurs crossing time anomalies back and forth. And this
I like the idea.
And this
you know?
was tasked with basically dealing with it, getting the dinosaurs back, that sort of thing. It's called Primeval. If you haven't seen it, if you're a dinosaur fan, I recommend it. It was really good.
I like the concept right now. I'll tell you right now, the concept sounds cool.
It didn't get more episodes, mostly because of the cost.
Yeah.
Because, getting dinosaurs. So there's Primeval, which was the one set in the UK, and then Primeval New Worlds was the one set in Canada. And they were amazing shows. I've watched them with the kids. I mean, they were a little scary sometimes for the kids just because, dinosaurs chomping at people. But
yeah,
I think it's a fascinating show. It's really good. It got some books in the world, too, that I own but haven't had time to read. I've noticed the link between buying books and reading them isn't one for one. So I'm like, oh, this book looks good. Buy. Crap, I've got 300 I haven't read yet. But, I see another one I like, I'll still hit buy.
Yeah, I think almost everybody who's a intrepid reader probably has a stack of the to be read stuff somewhere, usually by the bedside, maybe in the bookshelf, whatever. We all have a stack of those.
Yeah, I really need to start downloading when I buy them, like digitally, because right now, if Amazon pulls them, most of the books I own are gone because they're all on my Kindle.
No, you're right. You bring up a good point. Is I have a bunch of stuff to be read on the Kindle, and you don't even see that, right? It could be back in your to be read pile, and you'll never see it until you look onto it.
Yeah, I got to start. I really got to start making a list of what I want to read, so that way I have it somewhere. We're like, okay, look for this book.
Yeah,
so, I'll get better at it one day. Not today, but one day.
One day.
All right. So because we are no longer knuckle-dragging troglodytes, we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Oh man, I tell you, I think I must be postmodern then. I like my caffeine cold. Okay, so
Okay.
it's basically Diet Pepsi for me. I kid you not. Most people start the day they'll have tea or coffee or it is. I'm like, no, give me a nice cold Sam's Club Diet Cola or something like that over ice, and you'll find me sipping at that. That's how I get my caffeine. However, that's my drink of choice. But otherwise, a good Arnold Palmer on a hot day, especially after you're done mowing the lawn or something. That would count as tea technically.
Arnold Palmer's tea and lemonade.
Yep. That's good stuff.
Okay. I have never tried it, but I'm not a huge fan of lemonade overall. Do you drink like iced coffees or iced lattes?
Oh yeah, iced tea, iced coffee occasionally. They're just not my drink of choice. Just kind of if the mood strikes me, that kind of thing, I'll head on out and get something. Usually cut it with a little bit of sugar and some cream for me personally, with a good shot of espresso. When I lived in Los Angeles, some of the best coffee you could get were at Vietnamese sandwich places. Okay, and they had one. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the name, okay? But it was basically their iced coffee, which is already strong, with 3 shots of espresso, okay? Now, this stuff, the name on it, I can't pronounce it, but it basically means you are going to regret this and you have no one to blame but yourself. That was the name of the drink.
Yeah, I don't know. I started drinking coffee in college, and I just never really lost the taste.
Uh-huh.
So I did in the Army. Obviously everybody drinks in the Army too. But some of the stuff in the Army doesn't always hold up. So like we had this coffee company called Green Bean Coffee.
Yeah, I know that one.
Okay, so they were all over the bases overseas. And I remember drinking it and thinking this is some of the best stuff I've ever tasted. And I've got a buddy of mine that's been by one stateside. And Ian swears it's not as good as we remember. So it must be the combination of right place, right time, and you almost died today. So, of course, everything tastes better.
Yeah, I think that extra spike of endorphins probably does a number.
Right.
I will say that I have a question for you, though. I'm gonna turn it back on you, though. Question: if you're former Army, I think you said Army, correct?
Correct.
Do you still have one habit I could use to pick out somebody from the military at a distance? I'm curious if you have this habit. I used to work at a manufacturing plant. I was a biomedical manufacturing plant. Okay. Basically, we smashed together particles to make larger compounds for medicine, right? We had a lot of people. Almost all the people on the manufacturing line were veterans, about 90%. The way I could tell if they were veteran is if we went to lunch, we had a cafeteria, right? Without tasting the food, they would pick up a bottle of Cholula sauce or Tabasco and douse everything they ate in that sauce. That is an Army thing.
Yeah, the Marines do it too. I never really was big on spicy.
Okay.
I would trade that for other parts of the MRE. We had this expression, rat effing in MRE was where you'd sit there and you'd break it down and you'd take the parts you don't like and trade them with other people for the parts they like. It was just something you did because you never, like if you're going on the field, like you'd put parts in one MRE is designed to give you the calories you need for one day.
Right.
And so you don't generally try to eat it all at once. You'll stick it in your cargo pockets or whatever, and you might munch on part of it as you're going, through the ruck marches or whatever. And so you'd mix and match what you liked, what you didn't. And so I never got into the Tabasco. I always traded that for the gum.
My understanding was that with you putting up Tabasco sauce on anything, you can eat it. So that's, I think, that's how things should taste, was Tabasco or Cholula. Mostly Tabasco, but occasionally was, Crystal, I think was one of them. And the other was Cholula, had like a cork or wooden shaped cork. But that was what you could tell. Anybody else who would eat their food without dousing it with hot sauce was not somebody who was a vet. So
I look at body language. So posture, generally they tend to walk a little straighter. What purpose? You spend so many hours marching, even just in basic training, that it almost becomes second nature if you watch like how their hands and their arms swing in sync to the beat of a drum nobody else hears kind of thing. So that's always the tell for me. I mean, there's always outliers, but that's one I always notice.
No, there's that one. The other one in conversation, guaranteed if you're a veteran, you use military time. As in, I'll see you at 0800, things like that. Or
you can get away with that, and some of us do. I think that's more situationally dependent, because if you work in certain fields, you do it anyway. It's not just military time, it's the 24-hour clock. And so like in the medical field, they use it anyway. I would say body language is one. I've noticed that military depend on the era, but a lot of them won't change the running shoes that they were issued. So I still to this day wear New Balance because it was good enough for the Army. It's good enough for me. And so like, I think there are little tells, but everyone thinks of the military as a monolith, and it is to a point, but it's also situationally dependent based on where you served, when you served, and what you did, because different fields have different cultures around them.
I would go so far as to say, again, this is from my experience because dealing with a lot of people, a lot of veterans in my field, is that there's different cultures based on each branch. Very, very different cultures. I used to joke that there were different divisions of our plant that were treated differently based on what kind of branch of the services they were. You know, the traditionalists, you had, these guys were the Army folks. They were the ones who relied very much on rank and longevity, were the Navy folks. They were the Marines, the ones who always thought they got the worst of everything. They got the worst job, the worst equipment, everything. They were the toughest. They were the Marines. And then there was the people who worked in like quality and packaging, which nobody took seriously. So they were always called the Coast Guard. So,
yeah, I think
any coasties out there, that was from them, not me, just so you know.
So like, I think within the Army though, specifically as well, what you did as far as your MOS, so your branch, were you in the Army infantry, were you in the Cav, were you medical corps, whatever, like they have their own cultures too, which also, so it's a very layered thing. I can generally pick it out, and then when I'm reading, I can generally tell if they know what they're talking about when they describe action scenes. I jokingly call it my Barbie test, but
so what specifically an action scene makes you say, that person was in the military?
People that have never been outdoors, when they write things, everything will be too clean and sanitary. Anybody that's even been camping for 10 minutes knows that dirt gets everywhere. And so if it's too clean, that gives it away. If they understand body positioning, that'll generally be an indicator that they at least know something, because people that have never done it generally fail what I call the Barbie test, which is basically like, in order for this scene to be possible, I have to dislocate his leg, take it off, make whatever event happen, and then reattach it, because there's just no way a human body can bend that way. It implies to romantic interludes as well, because they start doing things and we're like, wait a minute, that was not the position they were in 5 seconds ago. You can transition fine, but you got to say you're transitioning, right? So it's an awareness of the body, and I think if you've played sports, you get it too. Any kind of physical activity, you recognize the limits of the human form. But mostly it's the mentality. It's like they understand the consequences. I've read some mil sci-fi where it's like Merc unit goes here, does a thing, Bob dies. We end up laughing like it's G.I. Joe, rinse and repeat, and there are no stakes.
Yeah.
But if you can go through those things and do those things and you don't have any effect, it's probably because you're a sociopath.
Probably. And it's funny you mention that, because in what we write right now, I'm not talking mil sci-fi or anything, I'm talking lit RPG fantasy. That is a common denominator I've noticed a lot, because this is fantasy. But in real life, you and I know it would take a great deal to overcome the inhibition we have to face killing someone. Usually that person trying to swing a sharp sword at you and trying to kill you might activate it. But otherwise, as you know, they train people very hard to overcome that inhibition, to actually go ahead and commit the act.
There's an interesting book, and I know, don't at me, but I know his research methodology has been questioned. But the book is called, by Neil Grossman, I think his name is, On Killing. And that's one of the things he actually talks about, is that the Army cadences were designed to dehumanize the enemy. That's why you get cadences like napalm sticks to kids, and a bunch more that I can't remember or are probably not really appropriate. But I mean, that's all designed to get the idea that you're not killing people, you're killing communists. They're not human. Right. And so like that all plays a factor too. And
it shows up in the genres that we have, because eventually the main character has to come into conflict and actually kill, sometimes multiple times. We don't really get into it as authors all that much about what that does to the psyche. Because remember, these are fantasy. These are fantasy vehicles to a degree. I do find it interesting that how many books I've read where people just brush off the deaths of friends or people they killed out of coming from an office job, and they just kind of shrug it off. It's interesting. It's just one of the elements of our genre. I'm not complaining about it. I just find it an interesting thing to keep note of, really.
So one thing I noticed, because I've been reading more game lit lately, and a lot of the big trope is the portal fantasy or the isekai, which comes from the Japanese, I believe.
Yes.
Space, I think, just means portal. But
Correct.
the idea is you get sucked into the game, the world, whatever. On the one hand, you want to show like, holy crap, we're not in Kansas anymore. Like you want it to have that transition. And so, yes, you need some of that. And the same thing with the fighting, if it's going to be a violent book. But on the other, you can overdo it because the genre is more summer read, bubblegum fun. It's not supposed to be the next Iliad, right? So it is a balancing act by genre. But you have to at least acknowledge that, hey, like sometimes I can't sleep because I think about X.
Exactly.
And it's the nod to it, to the realism. The other thing is, especially with fantasy, like there are some big like there are certain like people you don't want to make mad. You don't make horse people mad. You don't make gun people mad. They're gonna get it if you get it wrong. Like they'll know. And so like, there's this line where if you get the little things right, they'll believe the big lie. So like, of course it takes a day to get X number of miles, and you get those little details right, and then I'll believe the dragon because everything else build the verisimilitude in the world. Because you got that right, I'll give you the big lie. And I think sometimes people forget that. Like, if you understand reality, horses aren't cheap to keep. You've got to feed them, got to house them, got to worry about their hooves. Like, all of that means that probably not something the rank and file will have.
Right.
Without,
I agree on that one.
The kind of like some of the understandings of the worlds when they create things, like those details are what build the world. And if everybody has it, then it must be plentiful, and you have to explain how. And there's a whole economy of scale that you got to factor in, including certain jobs you don't think about, like who takes care of the horses and who takes care of the stables and all the things, right? Like all of that starts to matter. I mean, if we're being realistic in fantasy, probably we wouldn't even be using swords. Most people would have spears.
Probably.
But swords are just cool.
It's interesting because we're talking a bit about the audience and audience expectations, right?
Right.
And it's interesting because I happen to agree with you. I'm not a horse person per se, but I do know a fair amount about them. I've ridden them, that kind of thing. And yeah, what's funny is in lit RPG and fantasy in general, and frankly, if you've ever played D&D, like tabletop D&D, okay, people treat horses like motorcycles, pretty much, okay? Yeah, it'll take me 15 miles to get to this point. We'll just park him here, let the guy take care of him, whatever. That's if you have a relatively realistic thing. Otherwise, yeah, they just show up out of nowhere. We'll just leave them here. We won't tether them to anything. We'll just go into the dungeon, and they'll still be here. Stuff like that. It's very funny. I try to be aware of it. Luckily, I have not gotten too far into the horse people thing. Have not touched the gun thing that much, thank goodness. Because you get that right, they'll crucify you. I personally think, the people you don't, and I write around this so I don't piss them off, are gun people, folks who read Regency romance because they know everything about the Regency period. Civil War buffs, don't ever do anything with Civil War. They'll get you on the smallest little detail will ring wrong. And probably the worst of the bunch, and I say this with love, the worst of them are probably anybody who is into naval warfare, like a naval starting away. Frigates didn't have 48 guns in that time period. They had copper, things like that. Those people are amazing when it comes to detail. So if I do anything nautical, it's in the fantasy realm and I can get away with it. And that's it.
I agree. There's a reason that I don't do near future, because like I don't have to worry about remembering the cyclic rate of a 249 or whatever. Like I could look it up, but it's easier just to say, oh, he has insert laser gun or whatever, and then I can make it up, and I only have to remember whatever. And once you start playing with lasers, you don't have to worry about ballistics, which makes, I don't know. There's a lot of things you can do where you can minimize the need for details that ultimately don't push the story forward, and you can focus on the cool stuff.
Yep. I think so. And I think at that point, what you should focus on, my opinion is, and I think the audience might agree with me, is make your own world's rules, but just make them consistent. I.e. getting shot with laser gun A, ow, laser gun B, you just vaporized a moon. So make that consistent.
Yeah, and you see that some in Star Trek where stun them once and then they're out, stun them twice and they vaporize. But then you see other scenes where it's like, oh, I stunned him 3 times and his body's still there. Like, you just have to make it you have to be internally consistent. And like I said, we'll believe the big lie as long as you get the little details right.
Come to think of it, you know what? I would love to have written this device into something, except it would run afoul of so many copyright violations. But there was a very old comic that evolved into Robot Chicken. It was called Toy Fair Theater. And they had a lot of things that were set with stormtroopers. And the stormtroopers ended up going to Jedi Academy somehow. And they created what hands down would be the coolest weapon in a sci-fi arsenal, in my opinion. It's a gun. Just a gun, but it's a gun that shoots lightsabers. I'm like, that's awesome.
That was kind of cool.
I would love to write a book where the guy makes a gun that shoots lightsabers.
Yeah, that's one of those things where it's like, the only thing that I don't like is I didn't think of it first. You know what I mean? Like that's generally a rule where you're doing okay.
Totally hear you on that one.
Yeah, it's I don't know, some things are just more fun than others. But before we dive in, we're going to play the commercial so we can start talking about the book that brought us here. So we're going to air that beautiful footage. Boom.
Gunnery Sergeant John Doe is frustrated. He didn't join the Space Corps to be shuttled around in a ship. He joined to fight. So far, he has only seen a few skirmishes. He itches for a fight, something he can use to impress his junior Space Marines, as well as use to pick up chicks. Now that he's aboard the USS Big Stick, he hopes things will be different. The Space Federation has defeated their longtime enemy, and has decided another war was just what the people needed. One was intentional, the other was not. Either way, Gunny is excited. Now Gunny and the rest of the ship's crew must fight for their lives against an enemy none of them saw coming. What could possibly go wrong? Dive into the Vacuum Suck Hard Adventures of the USS Big Stick by J.R. Handley and Chris Winder, and find out for yourself.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. Okay. So that's when I realized that book is that writing comedy is not for everybody, because, oh my goodness, when you want to write comedy and you have to have double and triple and quadruple meaning, it makes writing, which I'm already not the fastest at, even slower. I had a blast writing it, but after I was done, I was like, never again. When it comes to that genre, I am amazed that you do it.
I'll tell you, I think you're off to a good start. I mean, that title is awesome, Vacuum Suck. And there's a certain, I guess people would call it pulp. To me, it looks an awful lot like the Roger Wilco series they had back around like 2010 and everything. It was one of those role-playing games that had a very retro look. That's what it looks like. I think it's going to sell. So
it's been out for a while, and it did okay. I mean, I paid back the cover, and it was originally Adventures of the USS Big Stick, but that when we found the art that the guy had made, Vacuum Suck Hard was already on it, and I'm like, that is just too perfect. We're keeping it, and we used that as the cover title, and then we made the title the subtitle. But it's one of those things where I was invited. MG Cooper put out a Space Pew Pew anthology that was all like space humor, sci-fi humor, and I was like, I don't know if I can do that, because my humor is barracks humor, and that's acquired taste. So I said, let me write 2,000 words and see what you think. And if you like it, I'll finish it. And if not, no harm, no foul. Because I wanted him to have time. I wanted MD Cooper to have time to be able to, make a decision before they had to fill the anthology. And so, we did. And they were like, no, but thanks. Because I couldn't tell it down. And then I couldn't get the idea out of my head. So I just finished it. It ended up like 30,000 words. But it was too crude, so I got my friend who's a former Marine to help me tone it down.
You asked a Marine to tone it down? Is this a good idea?
I mean, like, everything was a play on words. So, like, the enemy, they were fighting space Amish and the space Amazons, because why not? And like, yeah, because I was going for farcical, and so like the enemy assault team, I used the acronym TART because it was the Amazonian ships. Tactical assault readiness teams. All of the like guns and shields in the series were like analogs to prophylactics. And so I had too much fun, and I got it out of my system, and I'm still proud of it, but it was a moment in time for me.
That's great.
So, obviously, now that we've got that out of the way, we had our fun getting to know you. I think it's time to dive into the series that brought us here, which was the Master of Swords. I am going to put the cover up. So this is the cover. Obviously, it's that standard Royal Guard Publishing, pretty chicks on there. Now, did you write this with Marcus, or is he editor?
Marcus contributed a bit to it, but he primarily wrote in the editor role of this, so to speak. I'm the one who came up with the general concept for this, and though I have to give him credit, and Royal Guard Publishing, of course, for the cover. I think they did a great job with it. Very eye-catching.
Very eye-catching. So obviously they are doing audiobooks because they do for everything. Do you at least know who's going to be doing the audiobook yet?
I do. It's being recorded right now. The lady doing it right now, it's not a duo. It's a lady. Her name is Alyssa Poon. And she's pretty well known in this particular subgenre, actually.
Okay. What made them decide to go solo? Because they are pretty widely known for their dual narration.
Actually, I don't really know on that one. I will say the stuff that I've read, she does a pretty darn good job with both sexes' voices. So I'll give her credit with that. It could be they're trying out a new artist. I'm not really sure. But it's going to be interesting. I think people are going to look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an eye-catching concept. So let's talk about that. Where did the premise for the story, like, how did you originate this?
Okay. Originally, this kind of came out of an idea kind of from a little bit from a classic series called The Bulgariad, where you have excellent. Oh yeah, you're familiar. If you're familiar with a lot of people, that's kind of reaching back in time a little bit. Let's be honest here.
How I found fantasy.
What'd you say?
That's how I found fantasy.
Oh, did you? Well, you know what I'm talking about. It's a great. You've got the Chosen One. You've got a series of gods. You've got in the second series collecting. There's a woman who's collecting swords, things like that. It's got a lot of characters that are really cool. The idea was originally this is not the final version of it, but originally I had was this would be like an alternate version of Europe where this person would be transported to. It's an isekai story where in the world, this particular world is named Oxida, where the death god Krau Magor was about to take over the world. The good realms rally together and they bind the soul of each one of the realms, their token, their sword, their avatar sword, to go with the band of heroes to go fight this evil. They do prevail at a very high cost, but the swords are scattered at the end, kind of like the One Ring being lost. And they've been lost for about a century. And then we have our main character, a gentleman named Dante Castillo, who is isekai brought into this world. Now, isekai can mean a couple things. It can mean reincarnation. It can mean just transport to another world. This fellow doesn't die, but he is in classic form. You're kind of basically an orphan with not too many ties to this world, so he's happy to go to this one. And he is tasked by the goddess of that world to rescue these sword women. They're basically in limbo. He's got to find the sword and actually rescue the women and bring them over to him so that he can eventually become strong enough to take on the resurgence of the death god. Will take place over a course of 3 books. I'm not giving any major spoilers here because this is a very classic fantasy type. It doesn't matter that we've seen it before. What matters is the journey and how you get there. And it'll be hitting some very classic tropes along the way with a few twists. So that's kind of where it came from, really. Does that kind of answer that for you?
Yes. So, yeah, the Bulgariad was, like I said, that's where I discovered fantasy and the concept of being able to shift into a different form. Because remember the grandfather who becomes a wolf?
Yep.
So obviously this is men's adventure fiction and fantasy adventure. Is this what you would call gamelit then? Is it haremlit? Because I know they're for a couple things.
It crosses over a couple things. It's got some gamelit in there. I would even go so far as to call it lit RPG because we have some numbers. It's not particularly crunchy, but you do have advancement. It's definitely what I like the term that Royal Guard Publishing uses. It's kind of a catch-all. They use progression fantasy, meaning there are levels, there are skills to learn, there are special powers that you get. And they vary from person to person. For example, one of the women that he rescues, when she fights alongside him, it increases his fighting power, increases the level of how he fights by about 50%. Another person does not give him a bonus in fighting, but that person has magical powers that contribute to, say, a wizard duel or something else like that. In other words, you're more strong with your friends behind you, with your lovers behind you, so to speak, than you are by yourself. The Bulgariad, remember, had a similar theme. Obviously not an adult one, but it was, if you remember, kind of a coming-of-age story spread over 5 or 6 books for Garion. He had to accept over that long period, number one, he was in fact the chosen one. Number two, he was destined to fight the evil god at the end. And number three, he could choose to refuse his destiny. But in refusing his destiny, all it would do was end up with thousands upon thousands of people killed, and the end result would be the same. And so he chooses at that point to make that classic hero's choice to put himself on the line. And that's how we come to the climax of that series. Beautiful, beautifully done series.
I really need to reread that one with the kids. The Belgariad is where I reference the idea when it comes to magic. Like, he wrote magic so it was magical. It was like the Brandon Sanderson approach where you make it basically science. Like, that works for some people. I'm not knocking if you love it. I won't yuck your yum. But for me, David Eddings, it was so magical. You kind of knew it worked, but you weren't quite sure how, because magic. And so I remember the scene when the Belgariad, the main character, Garyon, was younger. And he's in this market, and somebody falls and they're blind, and he accidentally heals them of their blindness. And his grandmother that raises him was like, essentially to the fact that you shouldn't have been able to do that, because in order to fix a thing, you have to know a thing, and you don't know how eyes work.
Right.
And so they were like just amazed that he was able to do it because he didn't understand. That's the kind of, I think, when I think classical magic in fantasy, that kind of approach, where it's a little bit art, a little bit science, but mostly it's just magical and unknown. So
yeah, on that, yeah, go ahead.
So when you wrote the magic in this book, did you take the Sanderson approach or the David Eddings approach?
Definitely more of an Eddings approach. And that's the reason why I cited it to begin with, is because you have somebody who has that native talent, and they know they are the chosen one, or kind of said in so many words, right? But they don't necessarily want to go beyond a certain point, because who wants to send their whole life over going around risking yourself for people that you don't really know, or you don't even care that much about you. But once you come to love the world and the people within that world, you learn to become something better than yourself. And that, of course, is what triggers the magic, what brings that further in. You're stronger together than you are apart. That was one of the other themes I thought was so interesting, because one of the secret reasons I think the Belgariad was just so cool under the surface was, if you think about it, you had, again, by the end of this, you had the following kingdoms fighting together. Your classic medieval fantasy kingdom, okay? You had Vikings. You had Robin Hood type archers. You had knights from like Ivanhoe. You had the Roman legions from the Roman Empire. They even called them legions at one point. All these things mixed together that would normally be from totally different times and places on Earth were here in the Belgariad, and you got them working together by the end. That was cool, and that's what I'm going for, hopefully, by the end of this series.
I like the horse people the most. Now,
oh yeah, I forgot the horse people. You're right. The Algars, I think they were called.
Yeah. So when it comes to your world, like you mentioned, it's going to be a trilogy. Any chance that goes longer, like a Bane trilogy that ends up with like 5 or 7 books, or is it set in stone?
This is one thing I like about the genre that we write in fantasy, lit RPG in particular. I'll even go so far as to say harem lit in particular. These are audience-driven genres. What the audience wants, you will get. If the sales are there, by all means, this story can go on and continue on as long as you want it to go. There's more direct feedback based on reviews, based on just talking to the authors directly. I'll have to get contact stuff for you for Facebook and other things in a bit, but you can really influence. People have, just through their buying power alone in this genre, have a tremendous amount of power, much more so than anything that might come out of a mainstream publisher or a different genre, like, say, mystery or thriller, which are so diffuse, you don't have that dedicated fan base that will ask, we want to see X, can I have that? And you will literally see it pop up within a few months.
Well, I think part of it is TradPub is so big that it's not going to turn on a dime. And that's not a dig one way or another, but I mean, they've got a lot of overhead. They've got to schedule things. Whereas this is a genre, game lit and lit RPG, progression fantasy, harem fantasy. I'll throw that, or harem lit in there as well. Like, all of those tend to be independently or small press published. And so they have a lot more ability to be responsive to the fans in ways that, like, the traditionally published would only dream of.
I think I would agree with 100% with that. I agree. Yes.
So do you have it planned out, like, as far as we've got these milestones, or have you, like, how do you write when you do your stories? Is it something where you know exactly where it's going to end, or you just kind of have a general signpost?
Well, it's interesting, because I think it was George R. R. Martin who said there's 2 types of writers. There's architects, and then there's gardeners. The architects, the ones that build stuff, up along the way with mileposts and all the rest. And gardeners just kind of wander through and sprinkle seeds. And, well, let's see what germinates. Let's see what grows. Whatever grows, I'll pick that one and we'll go with that. So I always like that analogy. I guess I'm more of an architect. Typically, I create just in general. I know we want to hit these high points in a trilogy, and I know where to start and where to end the book. Then when I start the book, I'll actually sit down and make myself probably about a 10 to 15 page outline, actually, making sure there's certain plot points, making sure that there are certain elements that happen, certain themes that are hit again and again and again for the reinforcement. And also there's a little trick that's kind of interesting. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but about the 4 phases of your hero throughout the book and how fun it is to try to plot them and get them in there. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to focus on something else?
So you actually, not everybody. Okay, so some people are classically trained in that, the hero's journey, save the cat, all the traditional on writing that Stephen King did.
Yeah.
They use the classical, almost academic approach. Other people, I think, they've just read so much that they've almost internalized it, and so they do it without thinking about it.
Yeah.
So the hero's journey, I think, different from a heroine's journey, is that it's the story of one man trying to overcome. Whereas a heroine's journey is more a collection. It's an ensemble cast trying to overcome. And there's definitely a general arc of it. I don't think most people think of it in those terms unless they were English majors, though.
Probably not, but you know what? I think it's a lot of fun. I mean, some of the stuff you learn as a writer, you start seeing it in your favorite films. You point it out to people and stuff like that. Real quick, I think you find this amusing. One of the things I like to look at regarding the hero's journey, which a lot of people, not as many people are familiar with, is have you ever heard of a book? It's really about screenplay writing called "My Story Can Beat Up Your Story."
No, I haven't, but I like the title.
It's a great title, isn't it? And he points out that heroes and heroines, to a degree, I would argue heroines to a large degree, have 4 stages, okay? You have an orphan who becomes a wanderer, who becomes a warrior, who becomes a martyr, okay? And this is fascinating to me. It kind of blew me away, particularly the first one, because let me ask you this. Until you see it, then you're like, wow, this really is everywhere. Let me ask you this. At the start of A New Hope, what is Luke Skywalker?
I mean, he's on his journey.
Right? Question. Are his mother and father alive?
He's an orphan, farm boy.
He's an orphan. Question. What is Harry Potter?
He's an orphan.
What's Batman?
Orphan. Yeah.
Superman.
He's...
How about Will Turner from Pirates of the Caribbean? What's he?
Yeah, I think...
What about Simba from The Lion King?
So there's 2 reasons you do that. We call it fridging the family. You could do it for one reason. It gives them impetus for the journey. And it's in a reason for what parent in their right mind is going to let their kid do X, Y, and Z. I mean, there's lots of reasons for it.
Yeah.
The more common one. Yeah. I mean, it can be an internal motivation. Why did Batman fight crime? Because crime killed his family. Superman's an outlier because this whole planet died, but then again, they've retconned so much. It's okay, what version of Superman? And so
what I think is more interesting, though, is not your little orphans. I think it's actually something a little bit deeper than that. In my opinion, it's kind of fun. Again, I'll stick with film for the moment, but let me ask you, is John McClane from Die Hard, is he an orphan?
I don't know.
Probably not. But here's the thing. Not really, but here's the thing. He is an orphan in the sense of he is isolated. At the start of your films, he's a deadbeat cop, and he's divorced from his wife. Or take Tom Cruise's character from Top Gun. The name Maverick itself tells me he's outside of the herd. He is essentially an orphan, a professional orphan, if you see what I'm saying. Not a literal orphan, but they are set apart in some way. Most of your anti-heroes are orphans in that sense. So I find it interesting is, if you think about it, we were talking about the Bulgarian. What was Garion at the beginning of the story?
I mean, in a sense, he was an orphan. I get that, but he also did have family because he had his grandmother.
He did. He was raised in a happy, loving home, but he was technically an orphan. And then when you get to the rest of the story, you have someone who, at some level, is an orphan who becomes a wanderer. They move around. They try to find allies. They encounter enemies. when they're a warrior, they actually start getting together their family or their team and fighting back against the antagonist. And at the end, very often they will have at some level being a martyr, where they go into something where it's almost going to be sure it's certain death. That's what I find fascinating about that 4-part thing, is seeing how often that applies to some of the greatest stories around. Is you'll find elements of that in there, particularly the Bulgariad, since we're talking about that. 2 or 3 of the books, they're wandering around collecting allies. They collect a knight, they collect an archer, they collect a whole bunch of people. They start fighting back against the bad guys, and at the very end, Garion has to make the decision to martyr himself, to actually go in with the high possibility he's going to die against the bad guy. So it's kind of interesting how it follows that pattern. It's such a great series, in part because it follows that very thing.
Yeah, like I said, it's not something I focus on, mostly because I kind of tend to write instinctively. I mean, I outline, so it's a pacing thing, but it's a pacing thing I kind of learned just because I read so much. And
which is great, by the way. Your subconscious itself will write the whole book. You've probably woken up going, oh, I got to put this cool bit in here. And then it turns out to be the best part of your book.
Well, I also, like, you also learn by failing. And I had a book that barely broke even. And the reason was the pacing was off. It was all up, 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 and then crash at the end. There was no hills and valleys for them to rest and breathe. Uh-huh. So you kind of instinctively, by doing things that don't work, learn what does.
I agree.
When it comes to pacing. And that's what the hero's journey really comes down to, is about pacing the adventure and a cycle that makes sense.
I would agree with that.
Or if you think in terms of like games, you've got the little bosses that lead up to the big boss.
Yes.
So you've got the mini goals that get you ultimately to the end goal of the novel. Now, when you write The Master of Swords, did you write in terms of that, or is that something you retroactively applied?
Well, it's something I have actually keep in mind because I find it interesting. Okay. It's partially instinctual because you and I, for example, have probably read a lot of fantasy. We've seen a lot of fantasy. We've probably read a lot of science fiction, maybe military science fiction. We know the beats. We know the tropes. We have a love for them. People ask me, why don't I use the term cliche? And I think cliche is a negative term. To me, a trope is a good thing. And seeing how you can work something like that into a story and make it original and make it yours is very, very rewarding. In Master of Swords, for example, we have certain themes, certain ideas. We have someone who is separate from his world. He's been brought to a different world with a greater purpose. And he's going to be entering, say, some unconventional relationships, but all as part of building a friendship or a family unit that will go on to make him stronger and allow them to triumph in the end. That, again, is something you find in many, many more classical works. It's outside that subgenre. Just because this is more R-rated doesn't change that at all. It doesn't change the basics at all.
Now, some of the harem lit, if you read that, since you mentioned the R-rated, the story could exist without the romance. And then in others, the story exists as scaffolding for the romance. What would you call Master of Swords?
Well, Masters of Swords does require romance. It does require attachment, does require love. If you're looking at more of a scaffolding, that might maybe lean a little bit more over into erotica, is my opinion. One of the more interesting things, and this is not me saying this is actually my co-author Marcus Sloss saying this. He once described harem lit or a good harem lit as kind of like James Bond, but if James Bond dated and married the women that he slept with, that kind of thing. And that's kind of an interesting observation, really, to me. So
do you have Q?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you have the Q then? Because we all need Q in our life.
I imagine you could if you needed to.
Yeah, no, what I mean by that is, like, it sounds like the women are actually integral in this case to the plot in that they serve a point beyond just love interest. So if you took the love out and they were just characters and friends, the story still works. Whereas others, if you took out the fact that they were intimate, there is no story. So it sounds like the plot is fundamental for you.
It is. And the other thing, too, is in needing that, you have to have three-dimensional characters. You can't just have a plot device where, hot woman, and she has this skill, so therefore we're going to add her to a harem, that kind of thing. And I understand, by the way, there are books that do that work just fine. And if people who like them, that's great. We all need to have fantasies. That's fantastic. I personally like having more three-dimensional character because, among other things, you get to have that, discovery of, that's why I'm attracted to this person. That's why this person has a certain spark, that kind of thing. And I think that's what makes it a little bit more. Well, I call it a pure. Sometimes when I say romance, people have a different idea of it because I think a lot of people think of Hallmark romance, a lot of fade to black, that kind of thing, and that's perfectly all right. But when you're looking at different levels of spice, you'll find both in haremlit and reverse harem, which is this genre, remember, in the romance division for women, you'll find very similarly like that. You'll find more three-dimensional characters that need that extra bit of work in there.
There is some difference. This is what, when it comes to romance, I would call this genre men's romance, and that is a thing. And there are definitely stereotypes. I think the women in the men's romance tend to be, I don't know. You tend to like them better, and it's not just because they're pretty, because they have, the regular romance has attractive characters too, right? Like nobody wants to read a romance about someone they couldn't, fantasize as, this could be me in this situation, right? But I will say that from what I've read some of everything because I was an English major in college, and I did a whole semester of, comparing various subgenres of literature. So I've read hundreds of romance novels. I read them in high school because I thought it would make me understand women. Yeah, plot twist, it didn't. But I say that to say sometimes the men are there as just basically eye candy. They don't have as much of a personality, or they're there as a trope, bad boy billionaire, biker, mafia, whatever. And they're not really fleshed out as people individually because, again, they're just pretty faces. I don't see as much of that in men's romance. You see more, the characters are fleshed out and genuinely seem like people you'd want to meet, even if you weren't dating them. Whereas I can tell you, I don't want to meet a mafia guy on the street. Like that is not on my to-do list. I would be perfectly happy never to have done that. And so it's just a different genre with different expectations, I think. And so sometimes comparing it to traditional romance is more difficult.
I would agree 100% with that. I've seen similar things with you. I've read a lot of romance and everything in that genre. And one thing I find very interesting is probably the most relatable book you'll find in the romance genre. And I say this because they found out that one of the very few romance novels that came close to having 50% male readership was one, and that was the Bridges of Madison County. And I found that interesting because that had the most relatable male character I've ever read about in a romance story. So maybe we do, to a certain degree, read for that sort of thing. I don't know what the percentages of women who read haremlit romance, for example, is. But one would hope that in the better ones, you are going to see that same level of three-dimensionality that, wow, if this person existed in real life, I would like to meet them or date them or whatever.
I don't know. I was surprised it wasn't Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series because, I actually remember when I realized I'd been tricked. I found it because it was, this is back when you had to go to Barnes & Noble to actually physically buy the book.
Yes.
The books
those days in the Cretaceous period.
Right. And so I went and it was an end cap and it's like time travel and Jacobite Scotland and sword fights and gunfights and all the things. I'm like, dude, sign me up as, however old boy I was when this was released in the 90s. And I read the first two and then I realized my mom had the third. So I read that. And when I went to buy the fourth, it wasn't on an end cap. So I asked him like, oh, it's in the romance. And I'm like, wait, this is supposed to be a romance? Like I felt cheated. Because there is romance in it, but there are plenty of genres that have romance in it. But for me, the story was the time travel.
Right.
And so I'm surprised that's not on the list.
I'd be surprised if it's probably up there, though. Probably.
I wonder if that whole time travel aspect would work in like the progression fantasy, harem lit, game lit, all of those genres. It's essentially an isekai, except for instead of going to another world, you're going back in time. So, I don't know. It's an interesting thought.
That is an interesting thought. I don't know because I'm that also skirts heavily into the sci-fi area.
Absolutely.
And I don't know how much interest there is in sci-fi and lit RPG. There is some, obviously, but I see a lot more fantasy than I see science fiction for whatever reason. I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah, I think every sci-fi writer I've ever met wanted to write the epic fantasy too. So I think we all started with Lord of the Rings, and dreamed of doing it ourselves. So I think there's some of that. There are some sci-fi in the game lit like all those genres that Royal Guard does. Like there are some that do well. I think It's interesting. The one that you don't see a lot of is modern world stuff, and it's just because the idea of like a harem is a harder sell. Either reverse harem or regular harem. It's like it goes against societal expectations, and so you can't just say, "Well, this is just how we do things here," right? Like it's more. You have to explain how it's tolerated or how they're hiding.
Yeah, the only one I have seen so far that has done that was one called, I believe it was called The Alpha Shifter or something. Basically, the main character is a high schooler that turns out that once he hits puberty, he finds out he's a werewolf. And so all the women who want to mate with him are human women that are actually werewolves. So it's a scent thing, if you know what I'm saying. It's more of, I need to mate with you and only you because you've got the best genes. That's not quite the same thing, but it does take place in modern times. It's just not quite the same thing.
I think Logan Jacobs did it with How to Hunt Ghosts and Get Girls. Okay. And it was more low key because they're not out there like society, like they're just a group of friends kind of thing. It is some of the best paranormal I've ever read as far as that goes. Because I would before I had read that book, like it was about an army guy made good, so I'm like, I'll give it a shot. Before I had read that book, I would have told you I didn't like paranormal stories. And then I read it and I'm like, holy crap, this is kind of cool. Ghosties and wee beasties and stuff, But obviously you chose to go with a fantasy world. Was that because you grew up reading fantasy? Was it a strategic decision for you? What made you decide to set it in the way you did?
Well, partially a little bit of both. First off, I've read a lot of fantasy. We've been talking about the Bulgarian quite a bit. For me, my first ever fantasy book that really hooked me as far as like what magic is probably I have to go back a little further. It's the Earthsea trilogy by Ursula K. Le Guin. Her discussion of how magic works and how magic is basically the true language of things. And if you call things by their true name and gain power over them with their name, that's just awesome. That's cool. Okay. So partly was familiar with fantasy. The other reason Master of Swords is set the way it is, to be quite honest, casting my net for a good number of this genre's fans. Some people like, for example, medieval settings where you romance noble women, for example, right? Other people like monster girls, like goblins or elves or things like that. Other ones are more into, like cat girls, fox girls, things like that. I wanted a world that had a little bit of everything so that somebody could find, oh, well, I'm not too much into X, but hey, I like cat girls. He romances one of that and that. So I think that's kind of fun. Again, bringing in the element of the Bulgarian, you have a bunch of kingdoms that need someone to unify them and bring somebody from each one of those realms together and building that harem romance thing so that you have a family of people that are willing to work together by the end.
That works. Do you have a limit on the number of partners he ends up getting? Some people, 2's enough, 3's enough. Others, it's like, I feel like I need a roster to try to track everybody. And at a certain point in time, people are fleeing in and out of the life. And it's like, oh, okay, I'm done. And for some people love it. For me, I think there's some sort of ideal number where anything over that kind of gets unmanageable.
I'm laughing because it's funny. I'm remembering I'm trying to remember where I read this once, but what was the ideal number of sexual partners that a man should have in his life? A, 100, B, 5,000, C, 6 million. And the answer was B because 1 is too low and C makes you look cheap. But in my opinion, no, it's going to be a finite number. I'm not going to say how many because that's a little too spoilery there, but you're not going to need a roster. The reason being is I'm of two minds of this. And I perfectly get if you want the fantasy where you get to sleep with any person you want. There's a very famous harem-lit one where the fellow basically becomes the protector of an entire village of all-female Amazonian elves. And they all want to do him. And there's like 30 people. And I'm like, who is this person again? Wait, what was this? Okay, that person was the priestess. Who's this one? Like that, right? Anyway, first off, that's just confusing. It's kind of like going to you ever read a book where you get too many characters and it's like a cocktail party where you've been introduced to 30 people and you have no idea who anybody's name is, right? Too many folks. And I won't go say it's monogamy. I won't say it's gotten that, but it just does have a finite number of people you have in there. Otherwise, I think it gets too diffused. From a mechanical book point of view, people have to have a certain number of characters they can picture in their mind in a 3-dimensional way. Unless you're somebody like, say, Stephen King or George R. R. Martin who can juggle 30 people at a time, it just gets too difficult. So there's my answer for you.
Yeah, I think for me, it's partly with the brain damage. Like it gets to be too much to track
Yeah.
for me as a reader. And then, if I'm writing, there's definitely an ideal number of characters where otherwise everyone starts to see the same.
Yep.
Where it's like, wait, which one of the characters was that? I mean, I might not remember the name, but I can generally remember like personality types. If
Yes.
I can't even tell those apart, it's like, oh, okay, maybe we jumped the shark.
Yes, exactly. I'm agreeing with you on that one. Yeah.
So obviously this series is finite. You've got a set where the story ends, whether that's 3 books or 12, depends on the readership. Do you think you're going to keep writing in this genre when you're done? Are you having fun?
I'm having a lot of fun in this. Personally, I like the fact that I tend to limit myself in my past work. I write under other names. Okay. I'm not going into them here because this is a spicy genre, but I have written under the names, and I tend to write what I'd call a hard PG is about as far as I get. I don't even use much in the way of curse words, maybe one F or S word per book. And again, that is a genre, a reason, and an audience reason. There are some people who are very put off by salty language. I have no problem with it. I think it's fun, but can't do it in those. This is one of the ones where, yeah, I can do a little more gore. I don't fade to black, and I can say more curse words if I want. So I'm having a blast with it. As to whether I write any more in it, a lot of it has to do, again, it's with you, the readers. It's with the audience. If you like what we do, then support us just by, buying a book, give us a good review, and say, yeah, I want more of this. Or you can even say, I want more of this, and can I have a side of that, please, for the next book? You might very well get it. It's a relatively small but very dedicated and intense fan base in this area. Fantasy literature, even more passionate in lit RPG, and I would argue even more intensely interested in harem lit. They may not say it publicly, but the books do sell. So that's really it. It's going to be partly, yes, I'm having a lot of fun. Whether I go on to it, it's up to the audience and see if they like what I've done.
Works for me. Was there anything about this book series, let me throw the cover up there one more time, that we didn't ask you that you feel like we need to talk about? I mean, I like the basic concept. I like the swords. Swords are cool.
Yep. I'll just cover a couple real quick things. One, if you like swords, I'm not saying if you're a Forged in Fire fanatic, you're going to love the book, but each person does have a link with a sword that our hero will use throughout the book. For example, in the Starting Kingdom, which is kind of an analogy to, say, medieval Venice, the Contessa that he romances, her soul is attached to a spada di lato, which is a sword, an arming sword they had right before the rapier. We also have a German longsword that shows up in the book, that if there's a woman who's a member of the Saxa, who she's basically a ranger barbarian type, who this is a much different type of fighting. We have Francisca axes. We're going to have different swords and different ways of fighting and different ways to use these things in different books. So if you're into that aspect, because I know some people love swords, some people love guns, some people love that. That's an aspect of the book. If you try this one, the other thing too is, again, I'm trying to flesh this genre out with three-dimensional characters. These are women who all have their own motivations. They have their own backstories. They have different goals for being with the main character. Some are more love-oriented. Some are more, shall we say, relationship-oriented, but it's kind of for the power in the sense of, well, you're a noble, I'm a noble. Together, our realms will be a lot more powerful, and that's why I want to be with you. Things like that. For that very reason, you're going to find this book, I think, a bit more depth, perhaps, than some other ones in the genre, but by all means, give it a try.
Okay. And we have book 1 obviously out already as this airs. It's been out for maybe a month, I think, at the point where this airs on the 12th. Do you know when book 2's coming out?
Book 2 should be out in the fall. I'm thinking it'll probably be early October at the latest. It's being written right now. It's already been outlined. It's being put to paper. And we will probably have, Royal Guard Publishing has been fantastic with getting a audiobook out very close to the date of the ebook. So keep your eye out for all those, and also a compendium at the end. And like I said, if the readership is there, this will go on for 3 books. Or if you like it enough, but not this particular series, maybe you'll see me popping up in your inbox in another book.
All right, outstanding. And where can listeners and viewers at home find you? Obviously, we got Royal Guard Publishing. I got their link because that's your publisher, their website. We've got you on Amazon linked. You said you're going to have a Facebook and Twitter or something like that, correct?
Yes, I'll have a Facebook and Twitter up for you. I still need to put that up. Otherwise, just look for, you got my name, I think, oops, right over there. Right, look up that name on Amazon, and you'll find me there under Master of Swords, and you'll be seeing more pop up there in the near future.
All right, well, this is the part of the interview, dear listener, dear viewer at home, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books, so do your part. It really does matter. They tweak the algorithms, and they tell readers that might like your book, if you like this, you'll like that. All that stuff matters, so it really does. It's a big thing, especially for debut published books. And with that, you can find us on our link tree at linktr.ee, linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things: the BitChute, the Rumble, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Twitters, the email blasters and blades podcast at gmail.com. Again, blasters and blades podcast at gmail.com for professional purposes only, people. We have our Facebook group and Facebook page. And more importantly, we have Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and email. So send all the shenanigans her way. She's there for it. We have our website, which is over on Spotify, the Blasters and Blades podcast. The link itself is a bunch of gobbledygook. So trust me, just click the link tree. Makes your life a lot easier. But if you go to our website, you can support the podcast for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. These episodes are not free to produce, and every penny counts. So we truly appreciate your patronage. You could support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee until it pours out of their eyeballs. I said almost other orifices, and then I realized we'd lose our family-friendly rating. But seriously, we are affiliated with the Coffee Brand Coffee Company. It is an American company, not a dropship company. They actually roast the beans themselves in the U.S., employ American citizens, and you use the link in the show notes in the code podcast grunts, and you get 10% off. And we get a little bit of a kickback. It is a win-win, and their coffee is delicious. I've been drinking their s'mores lately. Pretty good. I enjoy flavored coffee, so I like to mix it up. Stabby's like some of the others, the bourbon one and the blueberry, which was not a hit for me. So, I mean, like, they've got a lot of options. They've got snacks. They've got teas. So check it out. You might find a new favorite, and you get to support American company. And, for those of you in the U.S. and care about that stuff, which I do, try to support local, that's a good thing. And with that, I would like to thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. All right, thanks for coming on, Hunter. And when this goes out, I'll get you all the links. And you have to come back for more chats. We do some panel episodes, and when you got other series out, because this is a lot of fun.
Awesome. Be happy to show up.
All right, and with that, I'm going to hit the end button. Wait for it.